September 1916. The Somme awakens in fire and fog as steel replaces flesh. Engines growl through the mist, crawling from nightmares men have not yet dreamed. Across torn fields, iron beasts rise and crawl. The earth trembles beneath them. Inside, men drown in heat and noise, swallowed by the monsters they command. From German trenches, disbelief turns to terror. Bullets ricochet off invincible walls of steel. The land strikes back. Mud consumes the machines, and nature claims her vengeance. At Cambrai, the beast learns discipline. An army moves with mechanical precision. When the smoke clears, victory feels hollow. Men sit beside broken giants. Steel marches forward now. No hesitation, no mercy, no turning back. And when silence falls, a lone soldier walks away from history's first engine of war. September 15th, 1916. The Somme Valley, northern France. Dawn broke over a world that barely resembled the one it had replaced. The landscape was nothing but churned mud and shattered trees, a wasteland where even the birds had long since fled. Across the front lines, tens of thousands of British and Dominion soldiers crouched in trenches, shivering in the mist. The air smelled of cordite, sweat, and decay. For weeks they had whispered about a new weapon, a machine that could cross trenches and crush barbed wire, that would end the stalemate once and for all. Most thought it was a cruel joke from headquarters. At 6:20 a.m., the thunder of artillery ceased. The silence that followed was so sudden it seemed to press against the eardrums. Then it began. A low, mechanical growl rolling through the fog from the rear. Soldiers turned their heads toward the sound, confusion giving way to disbelief. From the haze emerged hulking silhouettes, armored beasts crawling on steel treads, clanking, grinding, breathing smoke. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one private muttered, "They look like monsters." The machines advanced in slow, deliberate movements, treads chewing through mud, engines coughing dark clouds into the air. To the men of the New Zealand Division and the 41st Brigade, this was no longer rumor. It was something alive and terrifying. These were the British Mark I tanks, mankind's first true armored fighting vehicles, 28 tons of riveted steel, designed to do what flesh and blood could not. Inside each one, 8 men worked in suffocating heat and noise, a driver, gearsmen, and gunners who could barely hear each other over the roar of the Daimler engine. As they crept past the British trenches toward no man's land, infantrymen reached out to touch their armor, for luck, or maybe just to believe they were real. The tank columns spread across the Somme's scarred earth, advancing in formation, as though rising from the mud itself. Every revolution of their tracks left deep scars in the ground, a visual symbol of how modern war had devoured the old world of cavalry and gallantry. Inside, one of the leading machines, Lieutenant J.H. Watkinson of the Heavy Section, Machine Gun Corps, shouted orders through the clamor. The smell of oil, cordite, and exhaust was overpowering. Each man was slick with sweat, their overalls blackened from the fumes. The temperature climbed above 40 degrees Celsius as the Daimler engine roared behind them. When the tank jolted over a crater, men slammed against the walls, bruised but focused. Watkinson peered through a narrow slit, trying to gauge their course through the haze and smoke. Visibility was nearly zero, yet the mission was clear. Cross the German front line, destroy strongpoints, and open a path for the infantry. Across no man's land, the defenders finally spotted them. At first, the Germans didn't understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was armored wagons. Others believed it was a new artillery tractor. But when the first machine gun bursts sparked harmlessly off the tank's hull, confusion turned to fear. One corporal screamed, "Sie kommen mit Häusern auf uns zu." They are coming at us with houses. Panic spread fast. Some soldiers fired wildly, others ran. One German machine gun crew held their ground, aiming for the tank's treads, but the rounds did nothing but chip the steel. The machine kept coming, crawling, unstoppable. As it crossed the first trench, the earth collapsed beneath its weight, burying men alive in mud and timber. The tank rolled on. Behind them, waves of British infantry followed in awe. For once, the line ahead was moving, not backward. It felt like a miracle. Something finally worked. Private Thomas Hudson of the 9th Battalion, Norfolk Regiment, would later write in his diary, "It was like watching the gates of hell open, only this time we were the ones walking through." The first tanks reached the village of Flers shortly after 8 a.m. The church steeple was shattered, roofs caved in, and the streets were filled with rubble and smoke. Yet somehow, through the wreckage, the tanks pressed forward. Infantry streamed through the gaps they created, storming German positions that had resisted for months. One officer later signaled back a simple message to headquarters. "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers, with the British Army cheering behind it." For the first time in the war, machines led men, not the other way around. The Germans were stunned. To them, it seemed impossible, a moving fortress immune to bullets and shellfire. Officers would later describe it as the most shocking apparition since the invention of gunpowder. By midday, the Mark I had proven its concept. Not perfectly, many broke down or sank in the mud, but enough of them succeeded to rewrite what war could look like. The battlefield had just witnessed the birth of mechanized warfare. Mud. That was what defeated more tanks that day than any German gun. The same terrain that had devoured 1 million men now began swallowing steel. Of the 49 Mark I tanks deployed for the attack, only 32 even reached the starting line. Engines failed, gearboxes seized. Some machines bogged down in shell holes so deep that crews had to climb out through the roof and abandon them under fire. The tanks were triumphs of imagination, but disasters of practicality. Crude prototypes forced into battle before the technology was ready. In one field north of Flers, a tank named Daphne sank to its belly in mud, its treads spinning uselessly. The driver cursed and throttled the engine, filling the air with smoke and the smell of burning oil. Inside, temperatures reached unbearable levels. Crewmen stripped off their jackets, their faces slick with sweat and soot. A gunner fainted. Another vomited from the fumes. Lieutenant G.E. McPherson, commanding, tried to open a hatch for fresh air and was nearly hit by sniper fire. They were trapped inside their own invention. Still, those that moved, even limping, achieved the impossible. One lumbered straight through a line of German barbed wire, flattening it in seconds. Infantry who had once needed hours and hundreds of lives to clear such obstacles followed behind without losing a man. In other sectors, tanks crushed machine gun nests, silencing weapons that had pinned down divisions for months. The psychological impact was worth more than the ground gained. Many German units simply broke. Prisoners captured that morning spoke of moving fortresses and devils of iron. Some swore the British had harnessed magic. Others claimed the machines were crewed by demons. For soldiers raised in the age of horses and rifles, the tank was not a weapon, it was an omen. Back at British headquarters, reports began flooding in. Successes mixed with chaos. Some commanders were elated, others furious. The tanks that worked inspired awe. The ones that didn't left entire sectors stranded. Major General Henry Tudor, who had overseen their deployment, summed it up in a single sentence. The tank is magnificent in conception and miserable in execution. As the day wore on, the limitations became impossible to ignore. The Mark I's maximum speed was less than 4 miles per hour on firm ground, barely half that in mud. Its engine overheated constantly. Steering required 2 men, wrestling levers with all their strength. Communications between tank and infantry were almost non-existent. When one broke down, the men inside could only climb out and fight as ordinary soldiers, often dying beside the very machine meant to save them. But even in failure, something monumental had happened. Across the front, generals and engineers were already sketching improvements. Stronger engines, better armor, faster tracks. The seed had been planted, and war would never go back. Meanwhile, German commanders in the Somme sector sent urgent messages up the chain of command. One dispatch to the Second Army read, "The enemy is using armored machines of a new type, invulnerable to small arms fire. Immediate countermeasures required." But there were none. The Germans had nothing comparable, and no warning. The shock spread faster than any advance on the ground. That night, when the guns fell silent and the survivors stumbled back to their lines, they were changed men. They had seen something no soldier had ever seen before, the moment when the machine became the master of the battlefield. Across the front lines, panic spread faster than bullets. Reports flooded through German regimental headquarters, filled with wild descriptions of what their men had seen that morning. Metal houses rolling over trenches, machines that shrugged off rifle fire, monsters belching smoke and flame. Most officers dismissed them as battlefield hysteria until the first captured prisoners were interrogated. Every story matched. In the village of Goudecourt, Lieutenant Karl von Ruckteschell of the German 52nd Infantry Regiment stood by a field telephone, trying to calm his men. His voice broke through the static, urgent and disbelieving. "They are impervious to small arms. I emptied an entire magazine into one. Nothing. They just keep coming." Ruckteschell's report was one of the first verified German encounters with the British Mark I tank. By the end of the day, he was no longer alone. From Flers to Martinpuich, every unit along the Somme front had sent the same message. The enemy had invented a moving fortress. At first, German high command believed these were small, experimental machines, perhaps pulled by hidden tractors or armored wagons. When intelligence photos arrived 2 days later, showing the enormous tracked hulls and sponson-mounted guns, disbelief turned into alarm. The Oberste Heeresleitung, the German Supreme Army Command, convened an emergency meeting at Cambrai. Field Marshal Hindenburg reportedly studied the photographs in silence before muttering, "So, this is the English answer to our wire." His deputy, General Ludendorff, added grimly, "It will change everything." German soldiers on the ground had already reached that conclusion. Survivors of the 28th Reserve Division spoke of terror spreading through the trenches like gas. Some had tried to attack the tanks with grenades, crawling through shell holes to get close enough to throw them under the tracks. A few succeeded, disabling machines or forcing crews to bail out. But for every tank destroyed that way, 2 or 3 more kept coming. Even when immobilized, the tanks remained terrifying obstacles, armored bunkers that refused to die. Private Heinrich Müller later wrote in his journal, "It was like fighting against a factory that had gone mad. You could hear it breathing, smell its smoke, see its guns turning. We felt like insects in front of a machine built to crush us." The German press was slow to acknowledge the event, but rumors spread through letters and gossip. The British press, on the other hand, erupted with excitement. Within weeks, newspapers were calling the tanks the land ships of victory and the steel elephants of the Somme. Photographs of the ungainly machines appeared in illustrated weeklies, and for the first time since the opening days of the war, the public believed that a decisive advantage might have been found. Meanwhile, German engineers were ordered to study the new weapon immediately. The captured tanks provided valuable insight, crude but ingenious. The concept was clear: armor, firepower, and mobility combined in one system. Within months, German designers began working on their own prototype, the A7V, a massive armored box on tracks that would eventually enter service in 1918. But in 1916, such developments were still dreams on the drafting table. For now, the German army had only rifles, field guns, and courage to oppose the tanks. In the weeks following the battle, soldiers returning from the Somme carried the stories with them. They told comrades in other sectors about the machines that had rolled through barbed wire like paper, about how machine gun bullets had bounced off their sides, and how even artillery crews panicked at their approach. The tanks were still few, a mere handful compared to the thousands of men on the front, yet the psychological shock they caused was disproportionate. One German officer captured near Courcelette reportedly told his British interrogators, "You have broken our morale more in 1 day with those things than you did in 2 years of shelling." The comment, passed along to British headquarters, became a source of pride and confirmation that their mechanical gamble had succeeded. In London, Prime Minister David Lloyd George ordered a personal briefing on the tank's performance. Reports were mixed. Mechanical failures, communication chaos, poor coordination. But the overall message was clear. The tanks had worked where everything else had failed. The Landship Committee, which had overseen the tank's secret development under Naval Command, now found itself at the center of national attention. Winston Churchill, who had championed the idea during his tenure at the Admiralty, wrote that the armored caterpillar is destined to play a part of the utmost consequence in future operations. He was right. Though the tanks of the Somme had advanced only a few thousand yards and suffered massive breakdowns, their symbolic victory was immeasurable. They proved that the age of static trench warfare could end, that mobility could return to the battlefield. Engineers, tacticians, and generals now believed in the possibility of a new kind of war, and the enemy, having seen the impossible crawl out of the mist and roll over their trenches, would never again feel safe behind barbed wire. From that day forward, the legend of the tank spread through both armies. To the Allies, it was hope made steel. To the Germans, it was the harbinger of a mechanized future, one they would soon try desperately to match. The morning after the assault, mist hung low over the Somme. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the groan of the wounded and the distant rumble of retreating guns. All around lay the evidence of something unprecedented. Deep ruts gouged into the earth by the treads of the first tanks, smoldering patches of ground where they had fired their cannons, and, here and there, their broken hulks, burned out and still steaming. The new machines had changed everything, but not without cost. British engineers and officers walked among the wrecks, taking notes. Captain Ernest Swinton, one of the visionaries behind the concept of the tank, crouched beside a disabled Mark I and examined its cracked gearbox. The mud was so thick it clung to his boots like tar. He knew what he was seeing, proof of success and failure in equal measure. Of the 49 tanks deployed, only 9 had reached their final objectives. Some had broken down before the start line, their engines too weak for the terrain. Others had overheated or thrown their tracks entirely. Yet despite their flaws, the machines had done what no infantry could. They had advanced through wire, trenches, and machine gun fire. They had forced the enemy to adapt. The lessons were immediate. Designers realized the need for stronger engines, improved track systems, and better ventilation for the crews. The tank's interior was a nightmare, unbearably hot, choking with fumes, and deafening. Men came out of them half suffocated and nearly death, their eyes red from exhaust. Communication between tanks and infantry was non-existent. Flares and flags were all they had. If a tank broke down, there was no recovery vehicle, no towing procedure. It simply became part of the landscape, a monument to mechanical courage. Still, to the soldiers who had fought beside them, the tanks were more than just machines. They were a symbol of progress, of defiance against the impossible. One corporal wrote, "They were slow, ugly, and cursed things, but when they moved, you felt the ground tremble with hope." Commanders across the front began sending back their assessments. Some were scathing. The machines were unreliable, too slow, too few. Others saw something more profound. General Sir Douglas Haig, the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, declared that the tank's debut had fulfilled expectations. In his diary, he added a single line that would echo for years to come. "The potentialities of this machine are immense." Meanwhile, behind the lines, mechanics worked feverishly to salvage what remained. Broken tanks were hauled away, stripped for parts, or used for study. The factory teams back in Lincoln received new orders, 1,000 improved models to be ready within the next year. The war had entered a new industrial phase, one driven by engineers as much as by generals. In the taverns and rest camps, Soldiers talked about the tanks with a strange mix of awe and disbelief. Some described them as unstoppable. Others swore they were death traps. The word tank itself had been a code name during development, used to disguise their purpose by pretending they were mobile water carriers. The name stuck, and within weeks the press had adopted it, a new word for a new kind of war. The Germans, for their part, wasted no time studying the wreckage. Intelligence officers examined every broken tank they could find. They discovered that the armor was only 10 to 12 millimeters thick, enough to stop rifle bullets, but not artillery shells. They noted its slow speed, its clumsy steering, and its vulnerability once disabled. These weaknesses gave them ideas for future defenses: armor-piercing rounds, field guns set for direct fire, and new types of trenches designed to trap the heavy machines. But none of that erased the psychological wound the tanks had inflicted. In the German trenches, soldiers began referring to the machines as Teufelwagen, devil wagons. For the first time since the war began, German infantry no longer feared the British man. They feared his machine. The British Army, however, understood that it had unleashed something still primitive, still learning to crawl. The men who designed and drove the Mark I knew their creation was not yet ready to win a war. But it had done something greater. It had changed the imagination of warfare. The line between man and machine had blurred, and the Industrial Revolution had finally reached the battlefield. In workshops far from the front, new models were already taking shape: the Mark II and Mark IV, faster, more reliable, and armed with heavier guns. Each would carry the lessons learned from the Somme's mud, the mechanical failures, and the courage of those first crews who had driven into history. The tank had been born in agony, baptized in fire, and hardened in mud. The soldiers who witnessed it would tell their grandchildren of the day when steel beasts came to life and the earth itself began to move. While generals debated strategy and engineers studied wreckage, the men who had actually driven the first tanks carried memories that no blueprint could explain. They were pioneers in every sense of the word, volunteers pulled from infantry and machine gun units, trained in secrecy, and thrown into battle inside untested machines. Most were ordinary soldiers with no mechanical background, yet in September 1916, they became the first human beings to fight from inside armor. Inside a Mark I, life was a kind of mechanical purgatory. There was no insulation, no suspension, and no mercy from the noise. The Daimler engines screamed just a few feet behind the crew, filling the air with carbon monoxide and hot oil vapor. Communication required shouting into metal funnels or banging on the hull with wrenches. The gun crews fired 6-pounder shells and machine guns in near darkness, the only light coming from thin view slits or the dull glow of burning powder. The noise was constant, gears grinding, shells clanging off armor, the rhythmic thunder of the treads chewing through mud. One driver later compared it to riding inside an iron church bell while it's being struck. The temperature often rose above 50 degrees Celsius. Men fainted, vomited, and fought on in the fumes. When tanks caught fire, there was no escape hatch. Most had to climb through the same narrow opening they entered, sometimes while under machine gun fire. Yet despite the misery, pride held them together. They called themselves the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps, later renamed the Tank Corps, and they knew they were doing something history would remember. Private diaries from those first crews often sound like confessions from explorers who had gone somewhere man wasn't meant to be. Sergeant Frank Mitchell of C Company wrote, "We were breathing smoke and oil. The air was thick as soup, and the walls rattled with every hit. I thought the next would break through and end it, but when we came out the other side and saw the Germans running, that was when I knew the beast worked." Others were less romantic. Lieutenant Philip Johnson described the tank as a furnace that shakes, smokes, and hates you back. But even he admitted that the fear in the enemy's eyes made it worth it. The bond between tank crews was different from any other in the Army. Trapped together in heat and noise, depending entirely on each other's reflexes, they became a breed apart. Their bravery was not the charging kind. It was quiet, mechanical endurance, the courage to stay inside when every instinct screamed to get out. After the battle, survivors were given little rest. Many returned immediately to workshops to help build new machines, advising engineers on every flaw they had endured. Their feedback became the foundation of all future designs: stronger armor around the fuel tanks, better ventilation, improved steering, and rotating turrets that would one day define modern tanks. For the families of those early crews, letters home told little of the horrors. The existence of the tanks had been classified, so they could only write vaguely about new duties and strange vehicles. It wasn't until weeks later that the British press revealed their involvement. Only then did their relatives understand why their sons had vanished into secrecy, and why so many hadn't come back. When recognition finally came, it was modest: a few medals, a handful of commendations, and quiet words of thanks. The public celebrated the machines, but few remembered the men inside them. Many would go on to serve again in later offensives: Arras, Messines, and Cambrai, where the lessons of the Somme were tested again in blood and mud. Among the veterans of that first tank battle, one phrase appeared again and again in their memoirs: "We were the first to feel the world change." Because inside those cramped iron beasts, they had felt something no one else had: the heartbeat of the future pounding through steel. In time, armies would build faster, stronger, more efficient tanks, but none would carry the same mystery as those lumbering, clumsy pioneers that crawled into battle under the rising sun of September 1916. For the men who drove them, the experience was both nightmare and revelation, a glimpse of mankind's next step toward mechanized war, taken with trembling hands and burning lungs. They would never be quite the same again. When the guns finally fell silent over the Somme, the battlefield that had birthed the tank looked like the surface of another planet. The air reeked of mud, metal, and death. Broken tank hulls jutted out of the earth like prehistoric beasts frozen mid-roar, half submerged in the very ground they were meant to conquer. Crows gathered on the twisted frames. Men moved among them like ghosts, collecting spent shell casings, dragging out the dead, and marking where the new weapons had fallen. For the British, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette was hailed as a success, but the truth was more complex. The tanks had achieved tactical surprise, yet their mechanical limits prevented a breakthrough. The 41st Division advanced nearly 2 miles, the deepest British gain since the start of the Somme offensive, but at a cost of over 29,000 casualties. The Germans, though rattled, quickly reformed their lines. The front was once again static by nightfall. Still, word of the tanks spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had witnessed their advance told stories that grew with every retelling. Machines immune to bullets, monsters that breathed fire, engines that crushed bunkers and swallowed wire. The myth of the tank outpaced its reality, but that myth mattered. It changed morale. For the first time since 1914, many soldiers felt that science and industry might finally turn the tide. Behind the front, British engineers pored over the wreckage. They studied the tracks, measured the armor plates, dissected engines, and wrote pages of reports. Each damaged tank was treated not as a failure, but as a lesson. New models, the Mark II and Mark IV, were already being drawn up, with thicker armor, more reliable transmissions, and better visibility. The embryonic tank supply department worked around the clock to incorporate every improvement. Meanwhile, German intelligence officers scoured the battlefield from the other side. They photographed the wrecks, inspected the armor thickness, and analyzed shell impacts. Within days, they issued the first tactical memos on how to stop these land cruisers: concentrated field gun fire, deep anti-tank ditches, and armor-piercing rounds. The counter-revolution had begun before the first revolution was even complete. Civilians back in Britain saw the tanks differently. Newspapers published grainy photos of them rolling through villages, accompanied by headlines that spoke of unstoppable progress. Propaganda posters appeared, depicting the machines as instruments of national genius. To a weary public, numbed by years of trench warfare, the tank became a symbol of technological salvation, proof that human invention could outmatch slaughter. But for those who had been there, the sight of the tanks after battle was less triumphant. Lieutenant Robert Carey of the 2nd Battalion recalled walking past one overturned in a shell crater. It was on its side like a dead whale. The armor was torn, the engines silent. I remember thinking, that's what courage looks like when it's made of metal. The rain returned that evening, as it always did on the Somme, turning the battlefield once again into a sea of sludge. By morning, even the tracks left by the tanks had begun to fade. Only the deep impressions where they had crawled over the trenches remained, physical evidence of the first tremor in a new kind of war. The British High Command understood what had happened. The tanks had not won the battle, but they had announced a future. Orders were already circulating for mass production. What had begun as an experiment under naval secrecy would soon become a major arm of the Army. Factories in Lincoln, Birmingham, and Glasgow were assigned to the program. Within a year, hundreds of tanks would roll off assembly lines, heavier, stronger, faster. The men who fought at Flers-Courcelette could not have known it then, but they had opened a door that would never close. Mechanization had entered the vocabulary of war. The tank was no longer a rumor or a prototype. It was a fact of life, and every soldier who had watched it crawl through the smoke understood, instinctively, that the world would never again fight without machines. In the words of one anonymous letter published months later in the Times, the old gods of cavalry and courage are dying. In their place rise engines of iron, driven not by heroes, but by fuel. Yet still they need men to steer them, and perhaps that is our redemption. The Somme had swallowed men, but it had given birth to the future. In the months that followed the Somme, the British War Office transformed the idea of the tank from an experiment into a doctrine. The men who had fought inside those early iron beasts were recalled from the front to train new crews and test new designs. Workshops once used for tractors and locomotives now thundered with the sound of tank assembly. Welders, riveters, and mechanics worked under blackout conditions, producing machines whose existence was still officially secret. Colonel Hugh Ellis, appointed to lead the newly formed Tank Corps, insisted that the next generation of vehicles would not just support infantry, they would define the battle itself. The Mark II was rushed into production in early 1917, followed by the Mark IV, a sturdier version that could carry thicker armor, larger guns, and a crew of 8. Each machine weighed nearly 30 tons, but could still cross trenches up to 10 feet wide and crush concrete bunkers under its treads. In less than a year, the land ships of 1916 had evolved from prototypes into a true armored force. Training grounds were established on Salisbury Plain, where new crews practiced formation tactics, coordination with infantry, and signal communication. Engineers introduced smokescreens and wireless sets, laying the foundation for the combined arms warfare that would dominate the 20th century. Germany, meanwhile, was learning its own lessons. Though initially shocked, the German army reacted with ruthless efficiency. Field manuals were rewritten to include anti-tank tactics. Every infantry regiment was ordered to designate Panzerabwehrtrupps, anti-tank teams equipped with grenades, explosives, and armor-piercing bullets. Artillery units began training to fire directly at moving targets. In workshops near Berlin, German engineers began designing their own answer, the A7V tank, a towering, box-shaped machine armed with a 57mm gun and 6 machine guns. But the A7V came too late and in too few numbers. Only 20 were ever built. By the time they reached the front in 1918, Britain and France had produced over 6,000 tanks combined. The race to master mechanized warfare had already been won. The lessons of the Somme and Flers-Courcelette became gospel for both sides. Armies learned that tanks could not fight alone. They needed infantry to protect them, engineers to clear paths, and aircraft to spot targets. The battlefield was becoming a network of machines, each dependent on the other. In March 1917, British tanks returned to action at Arras. The ground was frozen, the mud less treacherous, and coordination improved. Though still far from perfect, their effect was undeniable. German strongpoints that once took days to capture fell in hours. Where the tanks went, resistance faltered. By November of that same year, the tank's true potential would be unleashed in the Battle of Cambrai, where over 400 tanks spearheaded a massive offensive without a preparatory artillery barrage. For the first time, tanks led the assault rather than merely supporting it. They crushed wire, overran trenches, and achieved a breakthrough that stunned both sides. German troops who had once mocked the British iron pigs now fled at the sound of engines. The shock was total. Even General Ludendorff, who had once dismissed the tanks as a curiosity, admitted, "The enemy's armor has rewritten the tactics of the battlefield." The tank had matured from a desperate invention into the centerpiece of a new kind of warfare, one that fused technology, industry, and human will. The same machine that had crawled through the mud of Flers now rolled across the open plains with precision and purpose. But progress had a cost. Every improvement brought new horrors. The tank's ability to move faster and strike harder only deepened the industrialization of killing. Men no longer saw the enemy as individuals. They were silhouettes in the periscope, targets to be crushed or burned away. The intimacy of combat had been replaced by the hum of an engine and the press of a trigger. In the quiet moments between battles, veterans of the first tank crews often reflected on what they had started. They spoke of the pride of invention, yes, but also the unease of what they had unleashed. They had dreamed of ending the slaughter, yet each new machine seemed only to make the slaughter more efficient. By 1918, the tank was no longer a secret. It was the embodiment of modern war, a union of man, metal, and fuel that had come to dominate the imagination of generals and soldiers alike. And as the war dragged toward its brutal conclusion, every nation understood the same truth. Whoever mastered the tank would master the battlefield. On the morning of November 20th, 1917, the chill air over northern France vibrated with the hum of engines. The landscape around the town of Cambrai was shrouded in mist, the ground hard with frost, a rare mercy after years of mud. Along a front stretching nearly 6 miles, 476 British tanks lined up in silence, their crews huddled inside the cramped metal compartments, awaiting the signal that would launch the most ambitious armored assault in history. The men had trained for weeks on the rolling fields of the English countryside, rehearsing formations and maneuvers that would have been impossible a year before. The new Mark IV tanks, heavier and better armored than their predecessors, carried fascines, bundles of wood used to fill trenches, lashed to their roofs. Others carried supplies and bridge sections. This was not an experiment anymore. It was the beginning of doctrine. At precisely 6:20 a.m., the calm was shattered by a single command passed down the line. "Advance!" Engines roared to life. Exhaust belched into the cold air, and one by one, the tanks lurched forward, their tracks churning frozen soil. No artillery barrage preceded them, no warning thunder of guns to alert the Germans. Instead, the tanks rolled forward under cover of fog, silent until they were nearly upon the enemy. German sentries looked out from their trenches and froze. The horizon seemed to move, a wall of steel crawling toward them, dozens wide, then hundreds. It was a sight no army had ever faced before, a mechanical phalanx. The ground shook as the tanks rolled over the first belts of wire, crushing them flat. Behind them came waves of British infantry, advancing at a steady walk, bayonets glinting faintly in the pale light. The Germans opened fire with machine guns and artillery, but the tanks absorbed it all. Bullets sparked harmlessly off their armor. Shells that landed short were swallowed by the earth. The tanks pushed forward, firing as they went, their cannons spitting flame and smoke. German strongpoints fell one after another. Within hours, entire sections of the Hindenburg Line, the defensive system that had repelled every British attack for 2 years, lay in ruins. By midday, British forces had advanced 5 miles, the greatest single-day gain since trench warfare began. Villages that had been names of stalemate, like Havrincourt and Marcoing, were taken in hours. German prisoners stumbled out of bunkers with hands raised, still staring at the machines that had crushed their defenses. It was the tank's first true triumph, the proof of concept that its inventors had envisioned back in the mud of the Somme. Reports flooded back to London, and the War Office celebrated the event as a turning point. The newspapers called it the miracle of Cambrai. Even the skeptics in Parliament were silenced, at least for a while. But the victory was not without its cost, and not without its limits. As the tanks advanced deeper into German territory, the fragile supply lines behind them began to falter. Fuel and ammunition ran low. Communication broke down. When German reserves counterattacked days later with fresh troops and heavy artillery, the British front collapsed under pressure. By the time the battle ended, much of the lost ground had been retaken by the enemy. Still, the lesson was clear. The tanks had achieved what no bombardment or infantry assault had done before: a breakthrough. For the first time since 1914, generals could imagine war without trenches. Across Europe, military thinkers took notice. In France, Colonel Jean Estienne began developing the lighter, faster Renault FT, the first tank with a rotating turret, the ancestor of every modern design. In Germany, engineers studied their defeat at Cambrai and concluded that the next war would be won not by men, but by machines. Even in the United States, still new to the conflict, General John Pershing ordered his own tank program, declaring that the future battlefield will belong to the armored. The men who had survived Cambrai were both exhilarated and haunted. They had seen what coordinated machines could do and what they could not. Some wrote home describing the tanks as rolling thunder made visible. Others said they would never forget the sound of steel tracks grinding over the bodies of men, friend and foe alike. The machine had no mercy. It simply moved forward. In a sense, Cambrai was the echo of the Somme, perfected and multiplied. The same idea, that technology could break the deadlock, had returned, but now it was real, tested, and terrifying. The British lost over 44,000 men in the battle, but the Germans lost faith in their defenses. The tank had proven its worth, not as a weapon of fantasy, but as the future of war itself. When the guns finally fell silent that November evening, the tanks stood scattered across the fields, their steel hulls glowing faintly in the firelight of burning villages. To the men who looked at them, it was clear. This was no longer a novelty of the Somme. It was destiny made of iron. And somewhere, in the quiet between bursts of gunfire, one old veteran of flair whispered to his crew, "The beasts have learned to run." By the spring of 1918, the war had entered its final, most desperate phase. The German army, drained by years of blockade and attrition, launched one last colossal offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, or Kaiser's Battle. It was their gamble to end the war before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. Across northern France, from the Somme to the Marne, millions of men once again clawed at the same broken ground where the first tanks had crawled into history 2 years earlier. But this time, the balance had shifted. The Allies had learned the tank was no longer a prototype or a rumor. It was a weapon system, integrated with artillery, aircraft, and infantry in coordinated assaults. The battlefield was evolving into something new, a choreography of machines. When the Germans advanced in March, they faced not just men, but mechanized counterattacks. British and French tank units struck back in short, sharp offensives, appearing suddenly through fog and shell smoke to blunt German spearheads. The effect was psychological as much as physical. German infantry, once confident in their stormtrooper tactics, now feared the sudden growl of engines. Many dropped their rifles and fled at the first sight of tanks looming through the haze. By the summer of 1918, the Allies were ready to move from defense to offense. The battlefield around Amiens was chosen for a massive coordinated strike, a test of everything learned since Flers and Cambrai. The plan involved over 500 tanks, supported by nearly 2,000 aircraft, and waves of infantry advancing behind a creeping artillery barrage. At dawn on August 8, 1918, the assault began. Mist clung to the fields as the tanks rolled forward in formation, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. British, Canadian, and Australian troops followed close behind, bayonets fixed, keeping pace with the armored columns. Within hours, the German front line collapsed. Entire divisions surrendered. The advance moved faster than anyone expected, 8 miles in a single day. General Ludendorff later called it the Black Day of the German Army. The shock of the attack broke their morale as surely as it broke their defenses. For the first time, Germany's officers admitted what their soldiers already knew. The war could not be won. From that point onward, the tank became not just a weapon, but a symbol of inevitability. The machine had stripped away the illusion of trench permanence. No fortress, no defensive line, no belt of barbed wire could promise safety anymore. Wherever the tanks went, the line would eventually crumble. The Mark V, introduced that summer, was the most advanced British tank of the war. With a more powerful engine, improved steering, and even the ability to cross enemy trenches independently, it represented everything those first crews at the Somme had dreamed of. Each tank carried a white-painted name on its side: Devil's Own, Britannia, Ajax, Resolution. Some crews even decorated them with chalk drawings and slogans, personal touches, in a war that had erased so much individuality. For the men inside, though, the experience remained brutal. Heat, fumes, and exhaustion were constants. Tank crews at Amiens reported hallucinations after hours of combat in confined air. Many emerged half-deaf and coughing up black soot. Yet they kept going, driven by the knowledge that they were part of something far larger than themselves, a machine that might finally end the slaughter. As the Allies advanced through the summer and autumn, the tanks became a familiar sight across France. Civilians watched them roll past destroyed villages and cheered, seeing in them a promise that the war might finally end. Children ran alongside them, waving flags, shouting, "Les monstres anglais," the English monsters. But the machines were not invincible. Mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and artillery fire continued to take a toll. In some sectors, tanks became victims of their own success, outrunning their infantry support and being destroyed by concentrated German guns. Many were left smoldering on the fields they had conquered, a reminder that progress always came at a price. By October 1918, the German army was in full retreat. Tanks led every major assault, from Saint-Quentin to Cambrai once again, carving through defenses that had once seemed eternal. The same fields that had swallowed Daphne and her sisters now echoed with the roar of hundreds of successors, faster, stronger, and far deadlier. The end came swiftly. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The tanks that had begun as crude, lumbering experiments now sat idle, along roads and in fields across France. Soldiers climbed on their hulls, posing for photographs, unaware that they were standing on the threshold of a new age of warfare. The irony was lost on few. The machine that had been built to end war had, instead, defined its future. In the aftermath, generals and politicians proclaimed the tank as the weapon that had broken the deadlock, the tool that made victory possible. But among the men who had driven them the feeling was more complicated. Many remembered their comrades who never came out of those steel shells. Some looked at the rusting carcasses of the Mark Is and Mark IVs scattered across the fields, and wondered if they had witnessed not the salvation of war, but its next evolution. They were right, because the machines born in the mud of the Somme would not rest. They would be studied, improved, and reborn in the decades to come. And when war returned to Europe in 1939, they would march again, faster, louder, and deadlier than anyone in 1916 could have imagined. The tank was no longer an invention. It was destiny, written in iron. When the armistice came, the tanks stood silent across France, hulking shadows on empty fields. Rain collected in their rivet seams, rust spread along their flanks, and the grass slowly began to reclaim the ground beneath their tracks. The soldiers who once fought inside them were scattered home, carrying stories few could understand. To the public, they were heroes. To themselves, they were witnesses to something that felt both triumphant and monstrous. In the years that followed, nations dismantled their war machines as part of the Great Disarmament. Dozens of tanks were scrapped for metal or left to decay in the mud. A few were shipped home as trophies, one to London, one to Paris, one even to Washington, D.C., monuments to the dawn of the mechanized age. But even as the world tried to forget the horrors of the Great War, it could not forget the shape of those machines. Military theorists began to argue that the tank had not reached its full potential in 1918. Among them was a young British officer named J.F.C. Fuller, who had helped plan the Battle of Cambrai. Fuller believed tanks could replace infantry entirely, that the wars of the future would be fought by fast-moving armored divisions, striking deep behind enemy lines. His ideas were radical, even heretical to traditional generals, but they found eager listeners in foreign armies. In Germany, where the Treaty of Versailles banned tanks altogether, a new generation of officers secretly studied Fuller's writings. One of them, Heinz Guderian, would later become the architect of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that would sweep across Europe in 1939. In the Soviet Union, military theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky took the same lessons and dreamed of vast mechanized armies rolling across continents. Even in the United States, a quiet fascination with armored warfare was growing in the minds of officers like George S. Patton, who had commanded a tank brigade at Saint-Mihiel in 1918. The ghosts of the Somme and Cambrai were whispering to the future. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, tank design evolved with breathtaking speed. Engines became more powerful, armor thicker, guns larger. The Mark I's lumbering 3 miles per hour crawl gave way to sleek machines capable of 30. Turrets rotated smoothly, radio sets linked crews across the battlefield, and rubber tracks replaced steel shoes. The tank had transformed from a mechanical experiment into the beating heart of modern armies. But with progress came dread. Veterans who had seen the first tanks in battle recognized the signs. They watched the rise of new armored divisions in Europe and knew that history was beginning to turn its wheels again. The promise that the tank would end war through shock and superiority had been an illusion. The machine that had once broken the trenches would soon break nations. Still, there was reverence in remembering where it began. On the Somme, the fields of Flers and Courcelette grew quiet again, dotted with memorial stones and fragments of rusting steel. Villagers unearthed bolts and track plates from their gardens, relics of the day when the earth itself had moved. Children climbed on the remains of old Mark I holes, their laughter echoing where once men had screamed. In 1927, the British government placed one of the surviving tanks, Clan Leslie, on display in London. Veterans gathered around it in silence, hands in pockets, eyes lingering on the riveted plates. Some wept. They saw not just a machine, but a memory, of friends lost, of courage tested, of the moment when humanity first stepped fully into the age of the machine. And yet, the paradox of the tank remained. It had been born from desperation, a tool to end a stalemate, but its success ensured that no future war could be fought without it. By solving the problem of immobility, it had opened the door to total war. In time, the tank would roll again, at Arras, at Kursk, at El Alamein, and countless other battlefields. The ghosts of those first crews, choking on fumes, sweating over jammed gears, praying their engines would hold, would ride with every generation that followed. The legacy of the tank was not simply a story of steel and engineering. It was a story of human ambition, of how far men were willing to go to win, to survive, to dominate. The same creative genius that had built cathedrals and ships of exploration had now built armored monsters to conquer mud and terror alike. At Fleers, on the centenary of the battle, historians stood in the same fields where Daphne and her sisters had bogged down. The grass had grown thick, the craters filled in, but the ground still held its secrets. When archaeologists dug there, they found fragments of armor, burned bolts, and melted brass casings. The war was gone, but its bones remained. Standing at the edge of that field, one historian wrote, "The first tank was not merely a weapon. It was the sound of the 20th century waking up." And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. The tank was never just an invention. It was a turning point, the moment when the courage of men fused with the logic of machines, when flesh and metal learned to fight as one. From the mud of 1916 to the steel storms of every war since, that fusion has defined humanity's darkest and most ingenious century. In the end, the Mark I was both a beginning and a warning, a symbol of what progress could achieve and what it could unleash. The first tank didn't just crawl into battle, it dragged the future with it. If you like the story and the content, please hit the like button and subscribe to watch new stories soon. Until then, write what tank, in your opinion, was the best tank during the World War I.